Tonight, we won't unroll papyrus to trace the speeches of emperors or the triumphs carved in marble. Instead, we'll follow the smoke curling from clay pots along Rome's narrow streets, where hunger was answered not by banquets, but by quick ladles, cracked cups, and coins passed from calloused hands. Here, the empire fed itself in minutes, not hours. Counters glowed with buried jars of stew, wine sloshed in bowls thinned with water, and bread. Always bread waited like a silent witness on every table. Some say the rhythm of the city wasn't kept by sundials or senators, but by the scents drifting from its thermopolia. Onions in the morning, fish in the afternoon, garlic by dusk. Rome learned long ago that survival, like empire, depends on keeping the crowd moving, full enough to march, loud enough to forget. So lower the lights. Let the warm haze of bread and smoke gather around you. And if your breathing begins to match the steady ladle stirring somewhere in the dark, that's just the night carrying you into Rome's kitchens. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next loaf baking in the city's ovens will be waiting for you there. And if you listen closely, the story begins not with emperors or marble arches, but with something humbler, the scrape of a ladle against clay, the hiss of wine poured thin, the rhythm of quick meals served to a restless city. The sound is soft, like a spoon in a thermos, and it means the stew is warm. The wine is not very good, and yes, the lids are mostly clean. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to hear more about amphorae and ladles and other thrilling utensils. Or you can just let the words turn into a kind of slow carbohydrate lullaby. Rome was very good at carbohydrates. The city fed hundreds of thousands of people every day, and it did it in a way that looks suspiciously like fast food if you squint places with counters, things in tubs, a short exchange of coins, a quick bite, and then back to the noise of carts and sandals and street vendors who could outshout a modern espresso machine. The storefronts were called tabernae, sometimes popinae or capanae, depending on who was fussing about social class that week, and the hot food shops with big terracotta jars sunk into counters were the thermopolia. Their counters faced directly onto the street, shutters folded up like eyelids, and the painted signs promised warm beans, spiced wine, maybe a bowl of lentils if the delivery came in, and definitely bread. The jars, the dolia, were wide as a barrel and embedded in masonry, so they kept a steady heat. Stew slept in them. Customers didn't linger. They leaned, they slurped, and they left. A Roman could tell the hour by the smell. Before noon, onions and porridge. Afternoon, fish and garlic. Late afternoon, wine that was hopefully watered, though watered is perhaps too polite when we mean diluted until it apologized. Bread and wine were the everyday combo, the standard order, the small mercy of cheap calories wrapped in ritual. The bread was not always white, not even often. It was speckled with emmer or barley, dense enough to double as an improvised coaster, and baked in round loaves scored into wedges panis quadratus, the quartered wheel that Pompeii's bakeries left us like fossils of breakfast. It came from local mills where donkeys walked in circles around twin millstones, humming in donkey, which is a language of patience. Wine, meanwhile, was the opposite of today's sommelier romance. Ordinary Romans mixed it with water, sea water if they were ambitious, and flavored it with herbs or resin or a drizzle of honey when fortune smiled. Workers drank vinum operarium, the laborer's wine, and soldiers swigged posca, a vinegar and water solution that sounds like a punishment, but was actually safer than much of the water. The city had aqueducts, yes, spectacular ribboned arches carrying mountains to town, but the pipes were picky, the cisterns were moody, and the Tiber was a river with big feelings. A hand-sized hunk of bread, dunked into a clay cup of diluted wine, was a kind of edible schedule, the way a commuter might consider a paper cup of coffee and a dry muffin a complete philosophy. There were add-ons, olives, a smear of moritum, that cheese and herb paste that always sounds like something you spread on a map, and the occasional pickled vegetable that had seen better summers. Rome was a city that ran on street corners. Thermopolium owners learned when to start the beans, so the steam would look inviting by mid-morning. They painted their walls with quick menus and reassuring mythological scenes, as if a prancing Mercury could bless the chickpeas. The counters were polished by elbows, and the jars were glazed with the memories of thousands of ladles. The food wasn't bad. It was enthusiastic. The cooks used garum, the fermented fish sauce that lived in amphorae and dreams, and they salted the earth with it. A little garum turned a pot of watery lentils into a meal, the same way a pinch of MSG can rescue a stubborn broth. If a customer liked you, they might ask for an extra splash, and this earned you either gratitude or suspicion depending on the neighborhood. The grain dole, the annona, kept the poorest from empty stomachs, but it was the small shop that kept the city from getting bored. Bread and wine, yes, but also pancakes of chickpea flour, or the crisp edges of fried dough were honey pulled and stayed warm, steady as afternoon sunlight on a wall. If you lean closer, you can almost see the hands passing coins, the predictable Roman copper that clicked like rain on the counter. The rhythm is soothing. Bread, wine, a ladle clink, a nod. Rome loved a routine. On another corner, or perhaps right next door, the smell changes and so does the crowd. It is fish time. A vendor with arms like braided rope is lifting battered fillets from hot oil. We are still centuries away from paper cones, so he gives you a small wooden plate or simply the fish itself, cool enough to hold if you keep changing fingers like a small domestic dance. The dip is garum, again, because Rome loved this stuff more than it loved a well-paved road. It is salty and fermented and surprisingly gentle if you do not think about it too much. Fish sauce came from factories along the coasts of Hispania and north. Africa vats the size of small boats where layers of fish and salt lay together in the sun and slowly turned into a liquid the color of patient tea. The best grades were mellow. The cheap grades came with surprises. My favorite quiet Roman joke is that there was a word for the solid dregs left after pressing the sauce a leg and people still ate it. Like the world's first budget spread. Fried fish was a minor thrill because the oil was expensive and the air was full of jealous noses. It crisped the afternoon the way a handful of chips does to a long meeting. If you wanted something sweeter, a vendor called out dolce sweet things, by which he meant small pastries glossed in honey and sprinkled with sesame. Honey cakes, liba and scripula, were the ancient substitute for candy bars, sold to children with a speed that suggests children have always had coins and nowhere to be. Bakers arranged them in neat stacks that looked like architectural samples. A small libum carried home to a shared room was a festival miniature, and when you bit into it, the honey stuck to your teeth like a promise that took its time. Rome's sweet economy included dates stuffed with nuts and doused in honey, a practice that seems excessive until you realize walking in sandals on volcanic paving stones burns through a person. Street drinks joined the sugar parade. Watered wine, of course, but also spice versions warmed in bronze kettles, and on hotter days, sellers of snow carried slushed mountain ice in baskets, wrapped in straw and dribbled syrup across its snowy back. It was a very slow precursor to a slushy machine, except the machine was a teenager trudging down from the Apennines yesterday. In the markets, you could find sellers of lupin bean salty, squeaky legumes that you pop from skins like tiny gifts, and carts with boiled chickpeas, still steaming, salted with a flourish that served as advertising. Some vendors specialized in sausage lucanica, the kind of meaty cylinder whose seasoning spent the day arguing amicably with the garlic. Others offered mortem in clay pots with an honest film of oil over the top, something you would spread on bread while glancing, without urgency at whichever set of columns was fashionable this season. Every few minutes, something finished frying, and a few minutes later, something else began. The city's appetite moved in waves. At night, the popane grew louder, and the food did not get better, but it did get more certain. You ate it because it was there. Sometimes the certainty is what you need. People who fought for a living had their own quiet menu. Gladiators are shown to us in art as sculpted marble trouble, but their bones tell a sleepier truth. They ate like dedicated porridge enthusiasts. In several cemeteries, their skeletons carry the mineral signature of heavy barley consumption. The nickname Horduri barley eaters was not an insult so much as a nutritional biography. Barley gruel, seasoned with herbs, and yes, a little garum gave slow fuel, the way oatmeal holds a morning together. Before a match, some drank a plant ash tonic, calcium-rich, and charred like the aftermath of a campfire, which perhaps tasted like discipline. Their junk food, if we can call it that, wasn't deep-fried bravado. It was calorie insurance, flatbread stuffed with cheese, dried figs, nuts for quick courage, and honey cakes for the small private victory of sweetness. Picture a fighter after practice, leaning against the shade of an arena wall, looking at a fig as if it were an unsolvable problem, and eating it anyway. There's something very humane about a handful of dried fruit before a dangerous day. It requires no explanation. Soldiers were the Empire's long-haul truckers, except the trucks were feet, and their snacks had to be portable and stubborn. The rations list is a litany of things that survive marching. Hard bread bosolatum, which was more like a biscuit than a loaf. Dried cheese compacted through the willpower of goats. Cured sausage, olives, and the vinegar water posca that kept a man hydrated without making him think too much about where the water came from. In the pack, there might be a pouch of parched barley or wheat, ready to become porridge at a moment's fire, and sometimes a plug of concentrated grape syrup. Daffodum, which is what happens when you reduce grape must until it's syrupy and optimistic. Add that to water or to wine or, in a pinch, to the kind of day that needs a better ending. Roman camps had bakeries because the army learned long ago that bread melts mutiny. Mills turned by mules sang their circular songs even in frontier forts. When the road offered a friendly tavern, soldiers bought the same snacks as anyone else, a bowl of beans, a plate of fried fish, a skewer of something brave, and they wrote down the prices in minds trained to count. The most complicated thing about these rations is how boring they look until you are 20 miles from yesterday. Then suddenly, a dry biscuit is a poem. Portable rations birthed portable habits. A soldier could grind grains between small hand mills, pour in water, and have pulls, the universal Roman porridge, in less time than it takes to wonder how long it will be until the letter from home arrives. It's not much to look at. It rarely is. Pulls warms the insides in a way that makes details fade. The smell of leather, the metallic note of a pilum, the always surprising cold of dewy grass at dawn. If a camp happened to be near a friendly farm, cheese and eggs joined the theme, and on lucky days, a cluster of grapes popped like mild cheers. Camaraderie, that subtle sauce, improved everything. Someone would bring out a pinch of cumin, another would fish a slice of garlic from a pocket where no garlic should have been, and that evening's porridge became dinner with names and jokes and a little boasting. A loaf of bosolatum soft by a soak in posca becomes edible, which is a technical accomplishment and also a metaphor for many things. The city, the fighters, the soldiers, everyone shared the convenience of food that could be bought quickly and eaten immediately. There were costs. The dark side of Roman fast food is not a thrilling scandal, more like an absent-minded shrug from a jar that should have been scrubbed harder. Food safety was theoretical. In summer, dolia turned into warm baths for bacteria that had not learned Latin but spoke it fluently. Garum was usually safe because of the salt, but the elect dregs, scooped and sold at a discount, sometimes carried unwelcome flavors with long memories. Fish from the Tiber, convenient and local, absorbed the river's civic gossip, which included sewage and runoff and the general feeling of being everyone's bathtub. Bakers sometimes whiten low-grade flour with chalk, which makes a loaf look like a better loaf. The same way a new coat of paint makes a wall seem safer to lean on. Lead showed up in places it should not be: pipes, glazes, cookware. The syrupy defrutum made in late pots that paired sweetness with a heavy metal afterthought. People didn't know. They were busy chewing, and the city kept moving. Even the word fresh had a relaxed Roman attitude. Bread baked at dawn counted as fresh at dusk. Stew that had simmered for days was considered well-behaved. The miracle is how often it worked. Food poisoning had a schedule too. On hot days, a popina might quietly switch the ladle from a questionable pot to a more recent one and hope the gods ate elsewhere. Patrons learned to trust certain corners, certain hands. There were rules, some posted, some remembered. No dice games on the counter. No fighting with skewers. Respect the line, even if the line is just people pretending not to be a line. The city's health sometimes depended on the speed of the afternoon breeze. Yet people kept coming because the alternative cooking in tiny rooms without chimneys, inside courtyards with the ventilation of a postcard, was worse. The thermopolium offered stew, but it also offered oxygen. If there was a fly in the wine, a finger flicked it away, and the conversation continued at the same pace as yesterday. Most meals were fine because most meals are fine. A city cannot function on emergency. There was, of course, another Roman food story happening at the same time on couches with their own furniture. When junk became excess, it did so with embroidered napkins. The upper classes held banquets that turned snacks into theater, where honeyed wines were strained through herbs, and peacocks arrived with their plumage reattached, which is the culinary version of giving a statue a wig. The cookbooks list confections with nuts and pepper and dates, and a sauce repertoire that reads like a map of the Mediterranean behaving like a spice rack. The diners reclined, which feels glamorous until you try to swallow while lying on your side and realize this position mostly encourages very slow chewing and a lot of conversation about property. People sometimes point to vomitoria as rooms for elegant purging. The word actually describes exit corridors in amphitheaters. It is a useful bedtime fact. The Romans did not, as policy, build special rooms to refurbish appetite mid-banquet. They were their excess in other ways. A sweet pastry that the poor ate folded in paper became a sculpture of the same pastry on silver. A humble street sausage, massaged with extra spice and served on ornamental toothpicks, was still a sausage, just very well connected. In the end, the remarkable thing is how unremarkable it all becomes. A city fed itself in the simplest possible ways. Counters, jars, bread, cups, frying pans, and a weather sense for when to ladle faster. People learned the locations of their favorite stalls, the way you learn where the light switch is in a familiar room. A thermopolium owner could have recognized regulars just by the sound of their sandals on the stone. The third step after the corner meant the bean stew needed a stir. Children remembered which honey cake seller cut larger pieces when he was distracted, and lovers learned which cup of spiced wine was safest to share. Soldiers on leave gravitated to the same popinae that plasterers and muleteers used, because cheap is a language everyone speaks. Even a gladiator, the barley eater, with a reputation like armor, still stood in line for a fried fish with garum because salt is democratic. If you are drifting now, let Rome's food become that background murmur that once was the city itself. A cart squeaks, a vendor calls, a pot lid settles with a ceramic sigh. Somewhere a baker's apprentice sweeps flour into tidy dunes. Somewhere a soldier measures out barley in the quiet of dawn. Somewhere a honey cake cools and then does not last very long. The details repeat because repetition is how you feed a city, and also how you fall asleep. Bread and wine. fried fish with sauce, porridge in the shade, a cup of something diluted into kindness. The ladle taps the rim again, the same small sound, and you could keep listening to it for a very long time, without hurry, until the steam becomes fog and the fog becomes night, and the night becomes a simple, satisfied yawn. You might not expect a city famous for marble arches and stern Latin inscriptions to have invented something as familiar as the late-night snack, but if you listen closely to the ruins, you can almost hear the clink of a ladle against a clay jar and the careful splash of wine that was never as good as the signboard claimed. If you're still awake by the time we get to the vinegar water favored by soldiers and other courageous people, feel free to subscribe, or don't. I'll never know. The point is simply to drift along the pavements of ancient Rome, where fast food was less an invention than a habit, a gentle rhythm of counters and coins of steam rising from terracotta, like soft breath on a cold morning. The typical Roman snack bar wore several names, because Romans liked options even when naming a doorway. A taberna might sell many things. A popina sold food and wine, and a thermopolium specialized in hot fare. Walk past one, and you do see a counter faced with bright stone chips, little mosaics for elbows punctured by round openings, or great jars. Dolia sat nestled like sleepy turtles. Beneath the counter, a charcoal fire hummed. Above it, on a painted board, an abbreviated menu made pleasing promises in chalk. Beans with herbs. Lentil stew with a confidence-building drizzle of fish sauce. Bread, always bread. Sometimes a rustic drawing of a rooster, which was not a menu item but a friendly logo, as if to say, "Good morning, it is 2 o'clock." Archaeologists still find wooden spoons, scorched lids, and amphora stoppers trapped in drifts of ash. The counters carry a shine where countless hands hovered indecisively and then pointed, a pantomime that has not changed in 2,000 years. Morning trade smelled like chickpeas and fennel. Midday drifted toward onions and a hint of stubborn garlic. By afternoon, the steam thinned, and you might see the proprietor leaning against the doorway, trimming a wick, judging the sky the way only a shopkeeper can. Bread and wine were the everyday combo, the default order for people with places to be. A round loaf from the baker, a panis quadratus, scored into 8 perfect wedges, fit the hand like a friendly wheel. Bakers stamped their loaves with little seals, so that if you left one at a communal oven, you could later rescue your own carbohydrate rather than a stranger's. The bread was not fragile fluff. It was purposeful, capable of supporting a smear of cheese, a heap of olives, or a passing conversation. Wine came thin and chatty. Romans diluted it 2 parts water to 1 part wine if you were prudent, or if your afternoon was already complicated. Honey could be added, especially to yesterday's wine, and herbs soften any rough opinions. The result was less a beverage than a permission slip to keep walking. On feast days, cellars ladled warmed, spiced wine condiment steaming lightly in bronze kettles. On ordinary afternoons, you took your cup, leaned on the counter, dipped a wedge of bread into a stew that had been keeping its own calendar for days, and pretended to read a fragment of verse painted above the doorway. The verse usually rhymed eat with repeat, which is a solid business model. Outside, the street spoke in clattering carts and the predictable rhythm of sandals. In a good neighborhood, the thermopolium might be fronted by columns. In a less approving quarter, it might shelter under patched timber. Still, the inner choreography was the same. One person washed amphory stoppers in a shallow basin. Another tended the coals with the exact patience of someone warming leftovers. A third sliced rounds of goat cheese that squeaked against the knife. There were always olives wrinkled, confident, glistening in a bath of oil that gathered little solar systems of herbs, and sometimes pickled turnips whose pink cheerfulness suggested they knew a joke you did not. Over the doorway, a wind chime made from broken lamp handles rang when the door shutters slumped back, and a stray dog, rhetorically named Felix, pretended not to live there. If you were very lucky, the shop provided a few wall pegs for cloaks, the way modern cafes supply hooks for coats and opinions. A different, small, bright, impatient told you it was time for fried fish. Somewhere along the Vicus, a vendor crouched over a pan of oil that had seen some things and was seeing them again. He slid small fillets into the heat and waited for that delicate edge between pale and promising, then fished them out with a perforated bronze spoon, so handsome you might have paid admission just to watch. You could dab the fish in a garum, a wine and garum dip that tasted like the sea, had gone to finishing school, or in a straight line of Lake Wayman. The baseline fish sauce that was to Roman cooks what salt is to ours, not seasoning so much as citizenship. Garum began life in coastal factories where layers of fish and salt matured under the sun until they politely dissolved. The clear liquid pressed from it was prized. The pasty dregs, alack, went cheap and still found friends, proof that thrift has its own flavor palette. The vendor would ask, with brine or with wine? And you answered according to your afternoon. For sweets, the street produced honey from every direction. Honey cakes, liba, scripula, crustula stacked in tidy towers on wooden trays, looked like architectural samples approved by bees. Dough was fried and drizzled, baked and glossed, sometimes sprinkled with poppy seeds that lodged themselves cheerfully in a molar until the next dynasty. Children learned quickly which vendor cut generous portions when distracted. Adults learned the equal and opposite lesson that the distracted vendor was never distracted for long. Dates stuffed with almonds and dipped in honey were little diplomas of indulgence, passed from hand to hand on feast days and ordinary ones alike. On particularly warm afternoons, a man with calves of iron might arrive bearing snow from the mountains, wrapped in straw and optimism to be shaved into bowls and kissed with syrup made from reduced grape must. It melted with the tragic timing of all shaved ice, but the first spoonful was a cool argument in favor of living near mountains. Street drinks formed their own gentle parade. There was milsome, wine laced with honey, served to anyone who wanted to believe in the benevolence of cups. There was posca, the soldier's pragmatic mixture of water and vinegar, a sharp, clean sourness that made warm water behave. There were infusions that put mint, pennyroyal, or rue to work in ways that modern regulations would enjoy discussing. Sellers of boiled chickpeas shouted rhythmically, as if the beans themselves insisted on punctuation, and vendors of lupin beans poured cones of salt into paper twist-offs, an ancient gesture that somehow contains every seaside holiday since. Nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, the occasional almond arrived roasted by the same charcoal that had just cooked someone's fish, and the smell braided itself through the street until you could no longer say where lunch ended and afternoon began. Gladiators occupied another corner of the Roman snack story, one that looks like a cookbook written by a patient trainer. The bones left behind at gladiator cemeteries whisper a barley secret. These professionals were horderi, barley eaters by design. Barley porridge provided slow energy. It was the edible version of a long breath. A training day at the Ludus might end with a wooden bowl of pulls made from barley fortified with herbs, a splash of oil perhaps, a crumble of cheese, and on lucky evenings, chopped figs trying their best to be dessert. Some athletes drank a tonic made from plant ash dissolved in water, which sounds like something you'd only try once, but the calcium likely soothed their bones the way a warm bath soothes a long day. Their portable indulgences were modest and honest. A pocket of raisins, a poundful of almonds, a honey cake in wax linen saved for a moment of quiet bravado. Standing in the shade of an arena wall, a man could eat a fig and think about nothing in particular. It may be the oldest performance ritual of them all. Roman soldiers were professional walkers and amateur chefs. Their packs carried everything the road respected: bucellatum, hard bread that softened mercifully when introduced to liquid, a wedge of aged cheese, a link of sausage, olives that never complained, dried fruits, and a flask of the democratic posca. A contubernium 8 men sharing a tent and a sense of humor often kept a hand mill. One turned the upper stone while another fed grain, the mill singing the circular song that turns hours into meals. At the evening halt, a small fire licked at a dented pot. Pulls again, this time with whatever the day had offered. A spoon of oil, a sprinkle of cumin, a herb pinched from the edge of a farmer's kindly field. When a fort was permanent enough, the army built bakeries, because nothing anchors morale like the smell of fresh bread cheating the wind. On the road, a sweet syrup of boiled grape, mustifrutum waited in a small jar to correct tired water or to sign the end of the day with a flourish. On festival nights, even a legionary might buy fried fish from a village popina and tell himself he was studying local customs. Portable rations produce portable manners. A soldier learns the exact amount of vinegar that persuades a biscuit into usefulness. A gladiator memorizes how long a barley pot takes to stop being stubborn. These are not thrilling facts, but they are the kind that keep a body at peace with its work. When you read a letter from a legionary to his family, send more socks, and remember the olives, you can almost smell the camp kitchen at dusk, and you understand why food historians fall asleep smiling. Of course, the shadow at the edge of this picture is the shadow that gathers near all food left to think for itself. The dark side of Roman fast food was not villainy so much as temperature. Summer did things to stew a loving cook would never permit. The Julia kept heat remarkably well, but well is not always the same as safely, and a pot that had simmered yesterday could grow ideas today. Shopkeepers stirred and salted and trusted their noses. Customers trusted the shopkeepers they knew. Fish from the Tiber, practical and nearby, sometimes tasted like a river with a hobby. Flour adulteration happened in hard years' chalk or ground beans, brightening a loaf the way optimism brightens an afternoon, and lead lurked in more places than a person would invite, especially when syrupy cepa was boiled down in lead-lined kettles. These were not crimes against cuisine, so much as habits of a world arranging itself without thermometers. People got stomach aches. People kept buying lunch. The city noticed and also needed to get back to work. The aediles, officials whose job included the markets, posted rules that sounded like common sense written with a stern pen. Don't sell rotten goods. Don't lie about measures. Don't keep the dice game on the counter running when serious customers arrive. Graffiti in Pompeii scolded certain taverns by name, which is the oldest form of review culture. 1 star for watery wine. 5 for the honey cakes near the theater. The Thermopolium of Esselina advertised its barmaids, Sheila, Egil, Maria, who must have kept an entire neighborhood gently hydrated. You can still see their workplace, the counter, the jars, the hearth, a doorway to a back room where someone almost certainly stored the better olives. In quiet hours between rushes, an owner might repaint a little Bacchus above the counter, hoping the god of wine would also be the god of bookkeeping. He often was. Then there is the curious phenomenon of snacks moving upstairs. Once the upper classes noticed the cheerful efficiency of street food, they did what upper classes often do. They commissioned improved versions. A simple city sausage became a carefully spiced lucanica served on silver skewers. Honey pastries acquired pepper and nuts and a poet to introduce them. Wine met cinnamon, saffron, and pepper until it tasted like a map. Reclining diners who had never tried to balance a bowl while lying on their sides until the architect insisted they should send a platter back, because the honey glaze was insufficiently philosophical, which is a very Roman problem to have. The same flavors wandered through the city in different shoes, cheap and lively at the counter, complicated and proud at the banquet. Somewhere between both extremes sat a clerk with a wedge of bread, a smear of Moreton cheese, garlic, herbs, and the belief that tomorrow would be mostly like today, and a cup of thin wine that had definitely met water. In the end, Rome's so-called junk food turns out not to be junk at all, just a steady procession of workable solutions. Food that meets you where you are at the corner. You always pass in the hour that asks for comfort, but not ceremony. A ladle knocks the rim in a rhythm no one wrote down, everyone knew. Bread is torn along pre-scored lines that match the geometry of a day. Fish hisses, honey thickens, olives shine, and the Tiber flows through it all with a long memory. If you are drifting now, let the city shrink to the sound of a counter being wiped, a shutter drawn, a charcoal bed being coaxed toward sleep. Somewhere a baker stamps tomorrow's loaves while a night watchman practices walking quietly. Somewhere a soldier decides the right moment to soften a biscuit. Somewhere a child saves a coin for a honey cake and dreams of a generous slice. The ancient street grows dim, not silent, just enough noise to hold a person gently in place, while the jars cool and the lamps complain a little, and then agree that this, too, has been a day. You might not expect the road to the forum to smell faintly of cinnamon, charcoal, and optimism. Yet in Rome, the side streets exhaled like kitchens, and the marble arches were essentially door frames for appetites. If you stay with me as far as the vinegar water beloved by soldiers, feel free to subscribe or don't. Either way, I'll still be murmuring about bread stamps and amphora stoppers as if they were close friends. This is a gentle walk through the unimportant miracles that kept a very busy city fed at inconvenient hours, which is to say, the birth of fast food without neon, packaged in clay. The first counters you meet are low and friendly, their tops speckled with little stones pressed into plaster, cool under the forearms of people making small decisions. Round openings hold dolia, those big-bellied jars whose job is to keep stew the way a lullaby keeps a room, not hot exactly, but persuaded. A thermopolium is the technical term, meaning a place that sells something warm, though the warmth sometimes had to be coaxed back with a stir and a look. A painted sign might promise beans, onions, a heroically seasoned sausage, and a wine that had definitely met water. Above the jars, a bronze ladle hangs like a moon on a hook. When it dings the rim, that is the bell of ancient convenience. A shop's frontage tells you about the neighborhood. In a respectable lane, the counter wears a border of red paint and the doorway has an actual hinge. In a lane that minds its own business, the shutters are good enough and the cat behind the jars is in charge. Rome ate bread in the way a city breathes. Bakers stamped loaves so they would come home from the communal oven with the right person. The way we label lunchboxes, except the lunchbox was a brick of confidence known as pans quadratus, pre-scored into 8 wedges. It made a crisp sound when torn, suggesting a moral lesson. Wine, meanwhile, arrived in amphorae with pointed toes, so they could stand upright in sand or in a rack that was essentially a thoughtful heap. It was diluted on purpose. 2 parts water to 1 part wine at dinner if you were sensible, more water at lunchtime if you planned to remember the afternoon. Honey was encouraged to help yesterday's wine remember better days, and herbs, fennel, savory. They made it seem as though the cup knew Latin. At the counter, you could have the standard combination, thick slice of bread, a ladle of something leguminous, and a cup of this chatty wine. You stayed long enough to eat, not long enough to feel you moved in. The same people came at the same times and stood in the same places. Regulars and ladles are how a city keeps time. If you watch the proprietor for a moment, you learn the daily maintenance of appetite. He lifts lids and listens, not for sound, but for the way steam smells when it is trying. He sprinkles salt from between finger and thumb with the accuracy of a minor priest. He trims a lamp wick so it burns like a thought instead of a complaint. There's a drawer of coins that click more than they add, a bundle of twine for tying parcels of cheese, and a wet cloth that knows every corner of the counter the way sailors know constellations. Sometimes an apprentice grinds herbs in a mortar with the solemnity of a civic ritual, which it is because dinner is public business. Somewhere a rooster is painted near the door. It means nothing except morning, which is all anyone also means by it. A different sound oil thinking out loud belongs to the fried fish man. His pan is wide, his spoon is perforated, and his patience is exact. Fillets slip into the heat and curl like shy punctuation. They crisp quickly because the oil has a history. Roman cooks trusted repetition. The fish come out the color of good ideas, and you choose a dip. A winagram is wine with fish sauce, which is what happens when the sea enrolls in finishing school. Liquamen is the base fish sauce itself, distilled from months of sun, salt, and an astounding level of commitment by coastal workers who turn small fish and thyme into something that can make beans taste like a decision. The best garum traveled in amphorae with proud stamps, whose factory, which grade, where the sun did the work. Cheaper alike, the paste left behind was the friend of thrift and of bread ends, and both have always needed each other. If your day leaned sweet, honey cakes answered in many dialects. There were globi, little fried spheres rolled in honey and scattered with poppy seeds that lodged amiably between the teeth until philosophy class. There were leba flatter, offered to gods and then to anyone who happened to be standing nearby. Market trays balanced stacks of crustula, which were exactly what a child pictures when someone says cookie. On feast days, another minor miracle appeared. Snow from the mountains persuaded down to the city wrapped in straw, shaved into bowls and kissed with syrups like melted sunsets. It did not last. That was the point. Nuts stood by hazelnuts and walnuts warmed in a pan until they announced themselves. And dates arrived stuffed with nuts and dipped in honey because once you own honey, it is hard to stop. Street drinks were a gentle parade of illustrated verbs. Mulsum, wine sweetened with honey, encouraged afternoon leniency. Posca made water behave by adding vinegar, a practice favored by soldiers and anyone unimpressed by questionable wells. There were herbed infusions that solved minor problems or created pleasant new ones. A cup of hot water with rue could make you agree that rue was a herb that existed. Sellers of boiled chickpeas sang their price in a rhythm the city remembered. Lupin beans came salted and slightly smug. A vendor with a small brazier warmed cheese until it sagged into a spoon and called it a service. There is a particular comfort in food designed to be eaten while standing that can make a person kinder without their permission. Across the river, in the shadow of training schools, food had a different accent. Gladiators were not the red meat romantics of paintings. The nickname that clung to them, horderi, the barley men, tells you most of what matters. Barley porridge, thickened into something you could stand a spoon in and then bounce the spoon with a walnut, carried them through drills. Pulse, the general Roman porridge, accepted additions with a kind of welcoming shrug. Chopped onions, a line of oil, herbs with short tempers. Trainers believed plant ash dissolved in water made bones resilient. Scholars nod sadly and say the calcium probably helped. After sparring, a honey cake would appear the way a towel appears, evidence of a system. Dried figs and almonds made a portable treaty between hunger and the next hour. The great secret of strength is that it mostly tastes like breakfast. Soldiers, meanwhile, walked for a living and ate like careful luggage. Their packs carried bashalatum hard bread that asked politely for water before participating cheese that understood travel. Olives that simply refused to be unhappy, and a sausage whose ingredients were written in the dialect of salt. In choir seasons, a contubernium, the team of 8 who shared a tent and a repertoire of comments, kept a hand mill and turned grain into flour with a rhythm that was basically music for elbows. At dusk, a small pot simmered something persuasive. Pulls again, with a handful of whatever the landscape wished to admit leeks if a field was generous, fennel seeds if a pouch remembered them, a scrap of pork if fortune developed a soft spot. Daffodum, a sticky reduction of grape must, waited in a jar to sweeten a mood or a sauce. Posca again, brisk and hygienic, cut the day into manageable lengths. On the march, the cuisine was less about recipes and more about a correct sequence of decisions, which is the same as strategy but tastier. Rations breed gear. A soldier's knife knew bread from everything else. His cup could meet hot stones without becoming a story. The leather bottle remembered vinegar as a character trait. Someone always saved a piece of cheese for later, and later sat there next to him, nodding. When forts were permanent enough, ovens followed because bread calibrates morale. Archaeologists who find military bakeries also find the architectural smile of an organized appetite. You can almost hear the morning shuffling, the banter about who gets first wedge, the amiable disagreement over whether cumin is a breakfast spice. These are the noises that made an empire not because conquest requires them, but because regular days are how armies decide to keep having weeks. Every system has gremlins, and Rome's were mostly little summers in pots. Food is a conversation with microbes. The city did not yet possess a microscope, but it had a nose and used it. A stew kept warm too long in Medolium would go philosophical in unhelpful ways. Fish from the Tiber was available, enthusiastic, and occasionally opinionated. Flour stretched with chalk or ground beans made bread that was technically bread in the way volunteer is technically present. Sweet syrups boiled down in lead-lined kettles softened both wine and resolve. Nobody intended chemistry to join lunch, and yet there it was, tastefully dressed as convenience. The Aediles market officials armed with scales, rules, and the energy of people who enjoyed tidiness inspected weights, find optimism and posted notices that were basically polite sighs carved in stone. Do not sell bad fish. Do not pour short measures. Do not gamble at the counter when customers can see you losing. Citizens left reviews the only way a wall allows. Pompeian graffiti scolds one tavern for watery wine and celebrates another for excellent chickpeas. A thermopolium named Asalina advertised barmaids whose names still survive, which is a form of immortality achieved by professionals who probably just wanted regular hours. Under certain time, you can still see the counter, the encaustic paint, the holes for jars, the hearth. It takes little imagination to supply the steam. If you pause there, you can also supply the quiet moments, lids propped to let a stew think. Spoons resting like oars between errands, the proprietor counting olives with the precision of accounting, and then the upstairs version. The wealthy noticed the vigor of street flavors and decided they would be improved by reclining while eating them. A simple sausage became a parade of Lucanica, seasoned differently in 3 provinces and then discussed at confusing length. Honey pastries acquired pepper because sweet things enjoy contrast, and pepper was an imported way of bragging. Wine met cinnamon, bay, saffron, and self-regard. The menu of the poor rose like steam and condensed into banquets were a tray of honey cakes, arrived with a poem and a servant who had memorized exactly how long to pause after each adjective. You might even see a dish designed to look alarming peacock, with all the feathers coaxed back into position served next to a very proper bowl of lentils, seasoned with the same smart little line of garum as the popina on the corner. Rome liked to play both halves of a joke at once. That decadence is easy to misunderstand. Most days were ordinary, and ordinary days built cities. A clerk ate bread dipped in Moreton cheese, pounded with garlic and herbs until it tasted like being lured, and went back to quills. A mason stood at a counter, blew on a spoon of stew as if it were a tradition, and probably complained about sand. Children compared honey cakes the way scholars compare manuscripts. Dogs revised their routes according to which vendors disposed of olive pits in ways that suited a dog's philosophy. The Tiber flowed past all of it, doing its long memory trick. The calendar turned not on battles, but on shipments of grain, on whether the figs were early, on whether yesterday's wine had agreed to be today's. If you're still awake, the last details are small and entirely comfortable. The ladle's rim has a smooth patch where a metal kissed clay for years. Bread stamps leave daisy-like impressions on the crust, which you only notice after the first bite when the geometry begins to matter. A cup of posca, sour and affectionate, makes warm water sit up straight, which is all Rome ever asked of water. The fish sauce amphorae, stored on their sides, whisper to one another in briny syllables. In an army camp, a hand knell sings sleepy circles while someone tells a joke without a punchline. In a closing thermopolium, a lamp is snuffed with damp fingers, the way a day is turned down. Counters are wiped with a cloth that smells faintly of time. The shop cat performs the ancient ritual of pretending not to be domestic. The shutters are hauled in, the street exhales, and the city rests on its enormous stomach, very pleased with itself for having solved hunger once again in small, sensible portions. You can drift now, where the jars cool, and the bread waits, and the wine accepts water with the good manners of an empire that planned to last the afternoon. You might not expect the world's first late-night snack run to involve a clay counter, a ladle the size of a small shield, and a bubbling pot that smelled a little like the ocean had secrets. And yet, if you wandered Rome at almost any hour, you could follow the sound of ladles tapping amphorae and find a thermopolium, which is basically a stone bar with big circular holes for sunken jars, each one keeping its stew acceptably warm and its steam politely contained. It's all very practical, very public, and although the Romans did not say fast food, they did say hot things sold quick, which is about the same, just with more vowels. If you're still awake by the time I get to the part where vinegar water becomes a beverage, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't hurry. You can arrive fashionably late, like a senator to a cheap bakery, knock gravely at the loaves, and pretend you understand the crust. The street bar, the thermopolium, was more than a countertop with jars. It had a rhythm. The owner wiped the rim of the dolia, those big belly jars, with the same cloth all day, which was a brave act. A boy hauled water. Another boy pretended the water was wine. A third boy knew exactly which amphora held the sauce that made fishermen frown. Customers leaned their elbows on the polished tufa and watched the steam letter itself into the air. Most food was ladled into bowls someone else had used many times, which added a note of continuity, a hint that you were not the first to enjoy the house beans and would not be the last. There were stools, but not many. Standing was efficient. Standing also suggested you were too hungry to sit, which is persuasive marketing without a single signboard. It was not only shop food. Bread and wine were the combo meal of the city, the can't-go-wrong order that went somewhat wrong anyway. Bread came in rings and rounds in neatly scored loaves. Some loaves carried a stamp from the bakery, a useful invention because Romans trusted stamps more than faces. Wine arrived impossibly young and defiantly sour, shipped in amphorae with painted labels that told you it came from somewhere that sounded sunny. Before drinking, they diluted the wine with water. It wasn't optional. Romans looked at undiluted wine the way you might look at a houseplant that has learned to drive. Technically possible, but against nature. A popular ratio was 3 parts water to 1 part wine, which made every cup an arithmetic exercise. The server would stir with a long ladle that looked like a thin oar, and your reward was a pleasantly weak drink that wouldn't scare the afternoon. The bakeries were loud. The millstones turned with donkeys trudging in circles, a very ancient metaphor for office life. Flour rose and fell in slow clouds. Bakers kneaded dough with arms and sometimes with feet, which helped the gluten and discouraged romance. They slid loaves into long, beehive-shaped ovens and pulled them out with paddles, stacking the results in pyramids that were almost architectural. You could buy yesterday's bread for less, the crust a little argumentative but still loyal. If you were thrifty, you'd break off pieces into a bowl, pour hot water or wine over it, and make a dish that was technically food and historically beloved. Bread and wine were everywhere, which is how you know they were not glamorous. Glamorous things are rare, Necessary things are stacked by the door. Those necessary things turn the streets into menus. Sellers shouted, but not too loudly. The city soundscape was already busy with cartwheels, street musicians, and the universal announcement that someone's bucket had fallen over. The food sellers learned a small, rhythmic chant. They showed you the crust, and the crust explained the day's baking better than any speech could. If the crust had blisters, the oven had been a little impatient. If the crust had that gentle freckled look, a patron had sent wood for the fire. The bread itself didn't mind. Bread is famously stoic. Wine was less stoic. Wine told stories when no one asked, which is a trait shared with certain uncles and certain amphorae that had leaked and were embarrassed about it. The snack stalls offered variety, though variety in the Roman sense means you can ask for beans and also beans cooked differently. One pot held chickpeas, dignified and reliable. Another pot contained lentils, which never tried to impress anyone and so remained universally welcome. A third pot, the adventurous one, offered bits of vegetable in a sauce that might have been yesterday's sauce or an early draft of tomorrow's. All of it was hot, all of it familiar and all important. None of it required your kitchen, which many apartments did not have. The street was the stove, the counter, the sink, and occasionally the critic. When people say junk food, they sometimes imagine excess. Rome's version in daily life was more about speed and comfort. Fried fish was a favorite, crisped in oil that had seen things, and handed over on a piece of pottery shard or a square of rough paper. There was dipping sauce because humanity loves to dunk. The famous garum, the fish sauce that lived along. Fragrant life in the sun before moving into your bowl came in grades, from fancy to present but not proud. The best garum was thin, golden, the edible memory of mackerel. The cheaper leftovers were called a leg, a paste you could spread if you were brave and had bread thick enough to shield you. A vendor might offer a little clay dish with 2 swirls of sauce, one mild, one opinionated. Families made faces at the opinionated one and then ordered more. The smell of frying drifted through alleyways like a rumor that kept being true, oil spattered. The cook used a slotted spoon that had outlived several owners and all their aprons. He lifted fish from the pan and shook it once, a ritual meant to persuade the oil to let go. A squeeze of something sour, perhaps vinegar, perhaps a citrus that had traveled farther than the average soldier ever would finish the bite. The line moved with an unhurried efficiency. People paid with small coins, or sometimes with tokens promised by patrons who liked to be thanked by proxy. Every few minutes, someone would ask if the sauce could be less brave today. The cook would shrug, as cooks have shrugged for millennia, meaning no and yes at once. Sweetness arrived as an event. Honey was the Roman sugar, a patient ingredient that required bees and luck. Pastry sellers produced little honey cakes, sometimes ring-shaped, sometimes folded over cheese, sometimes sprinkled with seeds because seeds made sweets look learned. Children followed the trays the way stars follow a constellation, not always touching, but always knowing where it is. There were treats called globy cheese and flour rolled into balls, fried, then bathed in honey until they shone like small moons. There were pancakes with poppy seeds, a breakfast that easily drifted into lunch. A poet could claim a cake inspired him, and no one would argue because honey has persuaded stranger ideas to seem reasonable. If you've ever eaten a dessert and then performed arithmetic to determine whether buying a second dessert is wise, you and a ramen have shared a private subject with the gods. Not all snacks were city luxuries. In the training yards where gladiators practiced not dying, meals were simple and deliberate. Contemporary observers called many of them hordery barley men because barley porridge sat at the center of their bowl like a retired champion who still came to every match. Barley is sturdy energy. Stir it with a little water, cook it until it behaves, and it gives you endurance without excitement. To that, add beans or peas, chopped greens when the season allowed, and an occasional splash of oil. There is evidence some fighters drank a tonic made with plant ash, a chalky mineral drink that would confuse a cafe menu today, but supplied calcium then. It tasted like a long lecture, but lectures build character. Trainers like things that built character, especially if character was cheaper than meat. Cooks for the training schools became quietly famous for turning modest ingredients into meals that felt heavier than their cost. They swirled porridge with herbs, added a scrap of cheese when a patron had felt generous, and argued gently about the right thickness for soup. The thicker the better, said those who cleaned the pots, because the thicker the soup, the fewer dishes they washed. Gladiators ate often. The point of their diet was not delicacy, but reliability. If a stew kept the hands steady and the legs predictable, it won. After a bowl of barley, a fighter would practice footwork, which is basically dancing with sharper shoes, and then he would come back for seconds. The kitchen kept the porridge hot, steady as a drumbeat. A spoon dipped in, moved away, returned with the rhythm of a quiet bell. On the march, soldiers lived a snack-forward life. Each man carried grain rations, sometimes close to 1 kilo a day, which sounds impressive until you remember he also carried everything else. Grain traveled well and complained rarely. It became porridge, yes, but also a kind of travel bread called busaladam, hard, dry, and fond of lasting forever. You could dip it in posca, the army drink of water and vinegar, which was bracing in the way that stepping into cold water is bracing. There were cheese chunks, sometimes dried fruit, more often simply hope. If a campaign went well, there might be bacon or a delicately salted mystery that everyone decided was pork, because hope prefers names. Soldiers roasted what they could on skewers and pretended things tasted of home even when they tasted of road. A camp at dusk became a kitchen field. Fires dotted the ground like stars that had chosen to sit with the men. Porridge bubbled in small pots, and someone always tried a creative experiment with whatever the quartermaster had grudgingly issued. Beans frothed, bread softened stews. The smell of garlic whispered a rumor of Italy even in far provinces. When a seasoning packet appeared, perhaps a pinch of pepper that had traveled from India to the mouth of a grateful legionary, it was treated like treasure. Spices were the polite luxury of the rank and file, a way to make the same ingredients feel different for one night. It is hard to overstate how much morale improves when a dish changes texture. A spoonful of oil made a stew shine. An extra handful of grain thickened it into tomorrow's breakfast. Of course, food that moves fast sometimes moves wrong. Street food walks a line between hot and hasty, and Roman summers push that line like an enthusiastic friend. Fish fried in old oil can develop personality, arousing attention from anyone who believes lunch should not talk back. Sauces that have lived too long in the sun collect complicated opinions. Sometimes a buyer blamed the moon, sometimes he blamed the cook, sometimes he blamed the gods, who responded in their usual way by doing nothing at all. There were no health departments as we know them, though collegiate guilds sometimes set rules, and markets had inspectors who looked severe in togas. A cellar accused of watering wine too boldly might be marked in chalk on the wall, which is less official than a fine but more durable. There is also the matter of water. Rome's aqueducts did noble work, delivering clean supplies to fountains and baths, while side streets made their own improvisations. People diluted wine from jars that might have entertained many guests, not all of them water. The safer drink for many was, paradoxically, that very diluted wine, or the soldier's posca, both acidic enough to have a little defensive personality. Sometimes the wine came flavored with resin. Sometimes it came flavored with the memory of the amphora in which it lived. Lead was a quiet hazard. Some sweetening syrups used it. Some pipes contained it, though the exact harm is a topic scholars enjoy the way some people enjoy crosswords. Either way, it reminds us that taste and safety have not always been close friends. Yet the city also knew another side of eating, the performances that called themselves banquets. Here, junk didn't mean cheap. It meant showing off with enthusiasm. Tables groaned with dishes that were more engineering than hunger. Peacocks wore their feathers to the table and then, through a complicated culinary theater, wore them again after roasting. Pork appeared carved to resemble fish or birds, a culinary pun in several acts. Sweet wines puddled in cups that caught the light like polite ponds. Guests reclined on couches because chairs were too honest, and slaves whisked away plates with the gentle sound of efficiency. The famous Velmatorium, despite its career in dinner conversation, was an architectural exit in amphitheaters, not a room for second chances. The real indulgence was slower and more architectural, course after course arranging itself like terraces on a hillside. Even at such feasts, the street followed. Honey cakes found their way into fancy trays. Garum, if expensive, still flavored sauces in a whisper that tastes faintly of the market. Bread anchored the table. Guests snapped pieces with their fingers as if breaking a minor rule. Someone composed a verse about a pastry swan. Someone else fell asleep between courses, which is a dishonor in poetry but an accomplishment in a soft room. Households kept staffs of cooks whose skills rose with the ambition of the host. Recipes traveled. Attempts were made. Sometimes the result was remembered because it succeeded, and sometimes the result was remembered because nothing else could explain it. At the edges of the feast, the city continued with its everyday bites. Children shared a fig and declared it exactly sufficient. A laborer bought a bowl of beans and planned nothing more complex than sitting down. Two scholars argued about whether a certain fish sauce was from Hispania or the Bay of Naples, and then realized they were arguing about lunch. An old woman counted coins for bread, slid two back into her purse, and decided to take the one with the nicer stamp. A baker closed the shop door at dusk and spent 20 minutes brushing flour from his clothes, watching it drift like pale snow that had changed its mind about weather. By night, the thermopolia glowed from their openings. The counters, polished by elbows, reflected firelight in little rivers. Someone played a few notes on a pipe. Someone else practiced a very short song about beans. The city breathed out the day through a dozen tiny kitchens. The jars settled. The ladles cooled. Dogs slept with the attention of philosophers. It was, by any measure, ordinary. That is the charm of it. We know the emperors and the victories and the theater of triumph, but the level, daily thrum of Rome is in its stacks, in the way a fried fish crisped and then vanished, in the shared knowledge that bread plus wine equals lunch, in the quiet arithmetic of how much honey makes a cake generous. If you map it in your head, the food of Rome moves like a slow river. At one bank, the street counter, where the poor and the busy eat standing up, holding bowls that grew warmer than their hands. At the other bank, the banquet couch, all cushions and choreography. Between the banks, everyone, gladiators with barley, soldiers with rations that outlasted weather, children with sticky fingers, bakers with honest burns, and cooks who shrugged their way through the ages. The ingredients repeat: grain, oil, wine, fish, beans, honey, but the repetitions are soothing, like looking at the same fountain every day and noticing the water is always new. Somewhere a vendor closes his shutters and leaves a little offering by the hearth, a crust of bread, a drop of wine, a thank you to heat for being useful. The alley cools. The last customer of the night swirls the bottom of a cup and reads the future in the sediment, which says very reliably that tomorrow will taste much like today, and that is good. Predictability is restful. A city that invented so much also perfected the comfort of the familiar bite taken standing up. The counter will be there in the morning. The jars will wake. The ladle will tap the rim just once, like a soft prelude, and the day will begin again with steam and a kind of patient hunger that knows exactly where to go. You might not expect the first drive-through to be built of stone. with round holes cut into a counter and clay jars dropping into them like sleepy moons. But that is more or less how the Romans arranged it. You walked up, you pointed at steam, and someone with the calm of a pond ladled supper into a bowl. The word thermopolium simply means place of hot things, which is charmingly honest, like naming a bakery warm bread. Counters were polished by forearms, the lids clinked. Dogs practice patience at ankle height. If you're awake a few minutes from now, you can subscribe, or you can just imagine a server tapping the rim of a jar toke like a very slow metronome, and let that do the same job. The layout rarely changed. At the front, a stone counter with round mouths for dolia, those big belly jars that held beans, stews, or wine. Along the wall, painted panels promised dishes that looked vaguely like flowers, because painting stew is hard. Sometimes there was a small shrine in the corner. A few coins lay there, shining like polite thoughts. From the ceiling, a bundle of herbs dried into stern, crispy versions of themselves. Children pointed at the pots and tried to guess by smell, the way adults guess by price. A shop boy wiped the counter in a figure 8 that never quite finished. Water simmered, and that was the whole advertising strategy. Bread made the city's thrum legible. In the Pistrina, the mills groaned in steady circles. Donkeys walked, blinked, and walked again. Millstones ate grain between their rough faces, and the flour rose like a tiny weather system. Bakers worked with salted hands and an understanding of time that lives in elbows. They patted loaves into wheels, cut them with that famous 8-spoked pattern for easy sharing, and slid them into ovens shaped like sleeping beehives. Even the carbonized loaves from Pompeii carry stamp names like Cellar or Modestus proof that bureaucracy can survive lava. Stamped bread meant accountability. If a loaf was light, you knew exactly which Modestus decide tomorrow. Wine did. It's best to be helpful. Most of it arrived young and eager, packed in amphorae scrawled with titular picti, those paint-on labels that say where the jar has been and what it thinks of itself. No one drank wine neat unless they were trying to make a point. Water met wine in a mixing vessel, and the two made peace at ratios that doubled as social advice. 3 parts water, 1 part wine for daytime. 2 to 1 if conversation had become philosophical. A spoonful of honey made mulsum, the friendliest drink in the room. Soldiers preferred posca, the water and vinegar blend that made thirst sit up straight. It tasted like resolve. It also made dubious water less interesting, which is exactly what you want. Breakfast could be as simple as bread softened in wine, or bread softened in broth, or bread softened in the knowledge that the day would be long. The poor had no kitchen, their stove was the city. So the morning line at the counter had the same faces arranged in slightly different moods. A mason with dust on his hair. A seamstress already counting stitches. A boy with a basket and a very serious job to bring home beans that did not escape the bowl. Someone always ordered a ladle from the pot that smelled like fennel and hope. The owner turned the spoon twice habit or ceremony, and the city took another bite of itself. Snacks had voices. A fish fryer sounded like applause. Oil burbled. The cook used a strainer with more history than most buildings and lifted little. Fillets out of the pan with a wrist flick that said he had done this yesterday and would do it tomorrow. The moment between oil and mouth held a decision. Which dip? Romans loved sauces the way cats love corners. Garum born from fish impatience at the shore arrived in grades. The good stuff was clear and golden, the edible whisper of mackerel. The budget version, Alec, was a paste that pretended not to be shy. You could mix garum with sour wine to make oxygarum, or with oil and herbs for a dressing that forgave a multitude of frying. The smell found the corners of alleys and wrote letters to them. People followed their noses with the deliberate speed of someone pretending not to hurry. A vendor might offer a sampler, 2 dabs on a shard of broken pottery, because broken pottery was the paper plate of the antique world. 1 dab was mild. 1 was adventurous. Everyone tasted the adventurous one, made a polite face, nodded as if evaluating a play, and then pointed at the mild. The adventurous sold out later anyway. That is the power of rumor in sauce form. Sweetness arrived like a festival that had run out of patience and come early. Honey was sugar's older cousin with better stories. Bakers fried cheese and flour globey and poured honey until the edges shone. Poppy seed pancakes crisped at the rim. There were date sweet stones removed, nuts tucked in, the whole thing kissed by oil and rolled in more honey until even the word restraint fell asleep. Sesame candies appeared as tidy rectangles that pretended to be nutrition. You could buy a libum, the old farmhouse cheesecake dedicated to household gods, and eat it reverently on a step because eating anything reverently makes it taste better. Sesame stuck to fingers, which improved conversation. Street calls had their own poetry. A cake seller sang monotone, hot, 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 not so hot, which sounds like a weather report but is actually a serving temperature menu. A nuts man shook his tray and made an argument for the acoustic joys of almonds. Children counted their bronze. They performed arithmetic with coins and then with crumbs. A good morning for a vendor was a tray that got lighter at the same rate as the shade moved. Along the pavement, when the tray outran the shade, it meant you had underpriced your pastry and were teaching an economics lesson to yourself taught in the training schools. The food changed tone. Less shimmer, more drumbeat. Gladiators ate for endurance. Grain, pulses, a little oil, and a respectable mountain of barley porridge. The nickname Hordery Barley Men wasn't a joke. It was a menu. Archaeologists reading bones found elevated minerals and plant signatures, proof that most of the protein came from humble beings. Trainers brewed an ash tonic from burned plants, mixed with water or sour wine to replenish calcium. It tasted like someone had talked a fireplace into becoming a drink, but bodies listened. After a bowl and a cup of chalky courage, men stepped back into footwork drills that looked like dance. Steps taught by a very stern choreographer. Cooks in those schools were quietly inventive within a narrow budget. They toasted barley before boiling to coax a nutty flavor, slid chopped leeks into the pot, and blessed the surface with oil. On days of celebration, victories, or patrons visiting, the pot received scraps of cheese or an egg whisked in to produce threads that looked like small, good omens. The kitchen had no patience for waste. Yesterday's porridge became today's fried cakes, set beside a dip of garum diluted to politeness. Eating was not a ceremony. It was a continuous negotiation between appetite and training schedule. Soldiers, meanwhile, turned snacks into strategy. A legionary carried his kitchen on his shoulders. Corn stones to grind grain, a small pot, a skewer, and a confidence in. Fire. Hard bread the chillatum rattled in bags. It was as soft as philosophy and just as filling if you soaked it first. Rations ran on grain because grain travels. In the evening, a contubernium 8 men sharing roof cloth and jokes made camp, ringed a fire with stones and set water to heat. Porridge again, but with garlic if the gods smiled, with a bit of bacon if the gods winked, with whatever herb. A nearby hillside had allowed. Someone fished a pinch of pepper from a packet as precious as a letter from home and made a small snowfall over the pot. The spoon went around. The world grew less complicated. On the move, they drank posca from leather flasks, sour and steady. It cleaned a mouth, settled a stomach, and gave water a new hobby. When the march paused at a market town, men spent coins on fried bits because fried bits taste like permission. A handful of olives, a wedge of cheese with heroic ambitions, a fake to suggest dessert, and a laugh at the fellow who bought too much and discovered that food is heavier once it becomes memory. Roman supply officers tried to be generous and occasionally succeeded. When they didn't, soldiers improvised. A stick leaned over coals became universal cookware. A flat stone heated by the fire became a griddle with grand ideas. Not every bite was a blessing. Summer heat made decisions about freshness without consulting anyone. Oil used past its patience-acquired tailies to tell. Garum stored in a jar that cracked at the rim started a new career as cologne for the alley. Beans reheated too often became philosophical about texture. People knew it and ate anyway, because hunger is a relentless optimist. Bakers sometimes stretched flour with cheaper powders, chalk, ground beans, bran dressed up as generosity. Inspectors scowled. Guilds lectured. Graffiti did the more effective work, chalking warnings that so-and-so waters the wine in a script vigorous, enough to outlive the painter. Water itself was a riddle with many polite answers. Aqueducts delivered excellent supplies. Household jars delivered whatever they had time for. Diluting wine made it safer. Boiling made it slower. Vinegar made it braver. Tinning copper pots kept flavors cooperative. Pitch-lined amphorae, adding a forest note that modern sommeliers would describe with unnecessary adjectives. There was even a sweet grape reduction differdom and sapa used to glaze and sweeten. Some cooks unknowingly thickened it and lighted. Vessels, some didn't. Historians still have patient arguments about how much harm that invited. The past rarely hands us a clean label. At the other end of the table, indulgence practiced cartwheels. The wealthy staged meals that used engineering to make a point about status. Whole boars arrived with sausages tumbling from their bellies like punchlines. Fish swam in platters of wine gelled with patience. Pastry swans wore their own feathers between courses, which is the culinary equivalent of a wink. Guests reclined because chairs implied working, and work was an afternoon word. The first course brought eggs, olives, and a fine tease of sauces. The second course told stories about geography oysters from one bay, mullet from another, birds that had never met the person currently complimenting them. The third course, the sweet course, raised honey to its gentle throne and asked if anyone would like a pear poached until it remembered summer. Moralists objected as moralists must. They wrote essays with titles like On Not Letting Your Soup Wear Jewelry. Sumptuary laws counted guests and weighed menus, and then life went on, because laws can manage numbers but not appetites. The cookbook attributed to apicus collected recipes that made kitchens into laboratories, brains with spice, dormice with poppy seed and honey, sauces that required 3 kinds of sour and 1 kind of brave. Even at these tables, though, the humble world persisted. A dish of broad beans dressed with garum appeared next to a jeweled roast, and the beans did not blush. Bread sat everywhere, breaking elegantly, reminding everyone that every banquet is a stack of ordinary meals wearing a laurel. The city's shadowed corners preserved their own etiquette. A thermopolium closed its shutters with a rattle that the street understood as tomorrow. The owner poured a little wine on the threshold for the spirits of the place, which is as close as a shop gets to saying goodnight. Someone late bought. The last ladle of stew at a discount, the universal reward for being behind schedule. Dogs found warm spots and demonstrated sleep in all its positions. A boy scrubbed a pot in small circles until the day drained out of it. The counter cooled, the lid settled. Across 1,000 corners, Rome's fast food exhaled and went quiet, like a choir dozing between hymns. If you keep following the food, you learn the city's meter. Morning bread, noon ladles, afternoon fryers, evening sweets. Between them, the lives that walked and worked, argued and bargained, fought and marched. A soldier gnaws a biscuit and names a hill after it. A gladiator scrapes the bottom of the pot, decides it's good luck, and wins on a Tuesday. A child keeps a poppy seed between 2 fingers like a secret star. A baker stamps a loaf and hopes the stamp is a promise. A rich man invites 14 friends and discovers that the part they talk about later is the honeyed dates, not the peacock. Rome is noisy in the history books, but at the counter it speaks softly in the easy grammar of appetite. Somewhere a vendor is already awake, stirring a pot that will taste like yesterday in the comforting ways and like today in the small, surprising ones. He checks the oil with a crumb of bread, watches the tiny bubbles write their poems along the crust, and nods. A jug of wine waits for its water. Honey sits in a jar that sticks to thumbs. The stone counter is cool under a palm. The city hasn't opened its eyes yet, but the first line of steam is rehearsing what it will say. It will say the same thing it said to farmers and masons, to poets and sailors, to the restless and the sleepy. There is a bowl here with your name temporarily written in it. Eat while it's hot, and later, when the heat wears off and the day leans into its long middle, the same counter will offer the same choices to a different set of feet. This steadiness is the opposite of a feast and the twin of comfort. You do not need a seat to belong to it. You do not even need to decide quickly. The pots do not mind. The lids will lift whether you frown or smile. A ladle will trace a slow circle and come back to the beginning. In a world that loved triumphs and monuments, the small victory of a good snack stood quietly in the street and asked for a coin. You gave it the coin, and it gave you the afternoon. That is the whole transaction, and it lasts gently as long as you do. You might not expect the birth of fast food to sound like water sighing its hot clay, but that is how a Roman morning often began. A ladle touching the lip of a jar, a soft scrape, a patient pour, the quiet clink of a lid set back in place. The thermopolium kept hours the sun would applaud doors open as light arrived, steam rehearsing its lines. Counters were masonry, cool and thick, with round mouths cut into the stone where great jars sat like moon craters filled with soup, beans, or wine. A child stood on tiptoe to see inside. Someone behind the counter wiped the rim with a cloth that had forgotten what it used to look like. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or simply imagine the slow rhythm of a shopkeeper's ladle counting the morning 1 spoon for him, 1 spoon for the street, and let that be enough. The sign promised hot things, which was all the law required. A small shrine watched from the corner, soot-smudged and optimistic. Painted panels pretended to be menus. Ducks posed nobly. Fish hovered as if discussing philosophy. Grapes gathered into round arguments. The smell helped with decisions. Lentils had an authority that chickpeas respected. A stew of pork and leeks lapped the side of the jar and made a faint tapping sound, which is, in the culinary world, persuasive rhetoric. One man asked for whatever the baker brought earlier. Another asked for nothing with garlic, which in Rome is like asking the Tiber not to be a river. Ducks practiced sincerity mere ankles. Coins clicked into a dish that had counted more lunches than a senator had sentences. People ate standing, because standing moved the line in the day. Bread, patient and circular, completed the scene. Bakers woke in a different night than everyone else, leaning into millstones that hummed like deep bees. Donkeys walked in slow circles, or the corn stood stone on stone, grain becoming weather. The dough took salt, a little leaven saved like a family story, and it rose in wooden bowls lined with yesterday's flour. Loaves were scored in that 8-slice wheel, so they could be shared without conversation, which is a very Roman solution. Some bore stamps Modestus, Celer, Primus, because accountability tastes better when baked. The oven, a dome with a mouth, ate logs and breathed heat back out. When a boy carried a basket of warm wheels to the shop front, the steam wrote brief letters to the morning, and the city pretended not to read them as it followed. Wine arrived bravely, young and chatty, wearing paint on labels that said who shipped. it and what it wanted to be when it grew up. No one respectable drank it straight. That would have been a little barbarian and a lot headache. Water met wine in a mixing bowl, and the two became citizens of the same cup. A spoonful of honey turned, the conversation sweet. A sprig of myrtle, a pinch of resin, a sigh of herbs, each cup a small treaty with thirst. The poor drank what the day could afford. The rich diluted longer and talked slower. Either way, the cup did its simple work, curving comfortably into a palm, clinking politely against another cup, finding a mouth that said yes sooner than now. The city's in-between meals made a good case for existing. Somewhere a pan of oil murmured like a friend who knows all your habits. The fish fryer lifted fillets with a strainer that had learned balance from long practice. He checked the edge for that precise color between sun and toasted straw shook. Excess oil free with one elegant wrist flick, and laid the fish down to rest as if it were a letter he would deliver personally. Garum waited in little bowls, translucent and golden in its finer grades, friendly and brown in its less ambitious iterations. There were mixtures, garum with vinegar for a tang, garum with oil for smooth diplomacy, garum with honey for the sweet tooth that pretends to be a philosopher. People dipped, they nodded, they made faces of polite concern when the adventurous bowl turned out to be very adventurous indeed, and then they ordered the regular. The smell wrote its own advertisement across the alley. Even those who passed, without buying, breathed deeper as they went by. Vendors worked with the theatrical calm of those who know time is a circle. A man scooped fava beans and shook them so the skins flashed like small flags. Another sold chickpea fritters, handing them over on pottery shards, which is economical, biodegradable, and accidentally modern. A cake seller sang the classic monotone. That meant fresh, still hot, also cooling, letting you choose your future. Children learned economy with bronze coins. They learned physics with crumbs. Honey cakes stuck briefly to fingers and surrendered, leaving a faint constellation of poppy seeds as evidence that dessert had strong opinions. A passerby in sandals squinted at a tray of sesame brittle and announced that he was not hungry. 5 steps later, he negotiated with himself and returned. Sweetness remembered the countryside even when it lived over stone. Honey traveled easily. Bees told their stories in the flavor. A simple dough of cheese and flour globy went in too. Oil came out puffed and met a tidal wave of honey that moved across it in slow confidence. Dates were pitted and stuffed with chopped nuts, then kissed by heat until the seams sealed like a promise. There were pancakes with poppy seed grit, good at sunrise, and better at the hour when the sun has not yet committed to afternoon. On festival days, the trays look like maps of generosity. On ordinary days, they look like plans that could be improved by one more coin. People saved a bite for the household gods, or forgot, and remembered halfway through and felt the pleasant tug of superstition. In the training schools where men practice being both artworks and arguments, menus changed register. This was food, designed to be a steady drum, not a trumpet. Hordium barley sat at the center, hospitable, inexpensive, and politely filling. The horderi, barley men, ate it as porridge cooked with water, sometimes boiled with herbs until the pot smelled. Like a small hillside, if luck lingered near the doorway, a cook whisked in an egg or grated a bit of cheese to turn the surface glossy. Trainers knew bones as well as butchers did. Ashes from plants, stirred into sour wine or water, made a calcium tonic with the exact taste you would predict from the phrase calcium tonic. It steadied the skeleton. Bodies listened. Between drill step, feint, pivot, breathe bowls were refilled and scraped clean with the same seriousness as a lunge. The kitchens behind those walls knew economies by their first names. Yesterday's porridge, cooled into slabs, sliced and fried, returned as cakes served with a sauce whispering garum. Leeks made frequent cameos. Lentils arrived as if they had never left. Oil, counted drop by drop, still found a way to bless a pot. On celebration evenings, the table acquired olives and nuts and a bit of fresh fruit. A man might make a quiet joke about living like a senator and then go back to stretching his shoulders until the whole room creaked in sympathy. Food and training braided together. The memory of a meal could loosen a tight hand as well as any speech. Across the Empire's long roads, soldiers rehearsed the art of portable appetite. A legionary's kit included the kitchen in miniature, a hand quern, a pot that had learned patience, skewers that doubled as arguments, a flask that tasted faintly of whatever it had carried last spring. Grain traveled better than promises. At night, a contubernium ate men who shared jokes, roofcloth, and the blame for everything ground just enough flour to make the fire worth its smoke. Hard bread, bushelatum, rattled in bags like a few small decisions. It softened in water twice as quickly as pride. They made pulls, that same Roman porridge, and if Prophet visited the market that day, the bowl received garlic, a strip of bacon, or an herb picked from the edge of a ditch with the solemnity of a harvest. Posca, the soldier's sour drink, carried the day like a canvas shoulder strap. Vinegar made shy water braver. A sip cleaned the mouth and reminded a man that patience is a kind of seasoning. On the march, dried figs strutted about like small desserts, nuts pretended to be dinner, and a wedge of cheese displayed a talent for making friends with knives. Pepper, pinched from a packet more valuable than sarcasm, snowed onto food in tiny blessed weather. When the march stopped near a town, men bought fried tidbits with the same logic that fills modern pockets with chips, salt, heat, permission. The important thing was that the pot boiled, the spoon went around, and the next day found everyone able to lift what needed lifting. Street food, by nature, flirts with misadventure. Heat glared at oil glared back. Vendors reused what should have retired. A lid failed to sit completely. Garum accomplished feats of aroma even when it was innocent. Someone stored wine where mice also had opinions. Beans reheated twice resigned themselves to texture. Inspectors tried to keep pace with scowls and fines. Guilds wrote rules with earnest punctuation. Satire did what satire does and named names on walls. So-and-so waters the wine, chalked briskly beside a doorway, accomplished more than a lecture. People shrugged and bought anyway. Hunger is talented at optimism. Water made a quiet difference. Aqueducts strutted nobly across valleys to deliver what was, for the time, excellent supply. But once water left the channel and found private jars, it acquired hobbies. Boiling helped. Mixing with wine or vinegar helped. Storing in clean amphorae lined with pitch kept flavors friendly, though it added a piney afterthought that modern tasters would describe with too many adjectives. Sweet grape reductions, differtim and sapothican sauces, and candied fruit. Some cooks made them in leaded pans without knowing chemistry's future. Some did not. We can argue in our heads while we drift off. The Romans were busy tasting whether the syrup had reduced enough dot at the other pool of appetite. Wealth rehearsed abundance like a play with too many actors. Banquets arranged courses as if negotiating with geography and patience. Guests reclined. Chairs belonged to people who still had quotas. First came the appetizers' eggs that proved they could be interesting after so many years. Olives showing off their brines, little sausages with garum behaving as if it were a spice. Then dishes, paraded, mullet from here, oysters from there, boar from somewhere storied, birds that looked at you with the polite accusation only birds can manage. And the sweet course, honey ruled with a quiet scepter, glazing pears until they remembered summer, coating pastries that pretended to be animals, dressing nuts that would keep hands busy while conversation wandered into philosophy's furniture, more or less. tutted helpfully from the doorway. Sumptuary laws counted desks, measured sleeves, weighed sauces with scales that rusted too slowly. A picayuse, or the collection of recipes wearing his name like a laurel suggested audacities, dormice with poppy seed and honey, brains and aromatic company, sauces balanced between sour and salt like a walker on a rope. Rich tables tried everything. Once, twice if the first bite made an amusing face. But even amid extravagance, the ordinary world slipped in. A dish of broad beans with mint, a loaf torn open and dipped into oil with salt that looked like small snow, a simple fig sliced and draped with honey, all of it the culinary equivalent of a deep breath. Meanwhile, the little places ended there, days with the calm of objects that know their function. A shutter slid into its slot with a wooden sigh. The shrine in the corner received a drop of wine. The cloth met the counter with a final ceremonial wipe. A last customer arrived breathless and hopeful. The shopkeeper peered into the jar, scraped the ladle around the edges, and produced a portion flavored with generosity. Dogs rearranged themselves into piles of intention. A boy scrubbed a pot with sand and made circles that would have matched. The stars, if the stars had been feeling tidy. The jars, empty now, looked like open mouths that had finished a long song. If you keep listening, you can hear how the city ate time. Morning began with bread steam and a line that moved in the same way every day, except for the days when it moved more. Midday clattered across counters. Oil hissed and relaxed, and people stood with bowls, talking about nothing that needed to be remembered. Afternoon meant sweets or the promise of them. Evening tested sauces against the assumption that hunger has standards. Soldiers ground grain by firelight until their conversation matched the rhythm. Gladiators rinsed bowls and practiced the slow art of sleeping muscles. A senator unfastened a sandal and declared that the pears had been persuasive. Somewhere a fisherman salted a future shipment of garum and made a face that said he was learning. Patience from the sea. The details arranged themselves into a lullaby if you let them. The stamp on a loaf is a soft drum. The ladle clinking is a bow with good manners. The frying pan applauds in little bursts. The word posca sours politely on the tongue and then gets comfortable. Honey behaves like sunlight in slow motion. Even the moralist, dear, worried soul writes another paragraph, and then eats olives with more enthusiasm than he intended. What ancient Rome called junk, we might call convenience, habit, or comfort. It was a series of small decisions made by hungry people who had places to be. The taste of a city is not a trumpet. It is the steady hum of a counter that has been wiped clean so many times. The stone looks as if it were polished by rain dot, and in that hum there is room for one more morning. The shopkeeper lifts a lid and checks the beans, nods to the dough seller, passing with a basket and arranges cups so their rims make a diagonal that pleases no one but him. The first customer of the day pretends to read the painted docs, then orders what he always orders. Somewhere a soldier adjusts his strap and thinks about garlic. Somewhere a baker stamps another loaf and hopes the stamp will be read kindly. Somewhere a child tastes honey and forms an opinion about joy. The city, without needing to declare anything, opens its mouth again and says, in a warm, practical voice, that there is time for one more bite before the day becomes history. You might not expect the world's first fast food counters to be carved from stone, but in Rome, the menu began in masonry. Before the city was properly awake, a shopkeeper slid a wooden shutter up with the sigh of old boards and revealed a counter. As smooth as river pebbles, its top punctured by round mouths holding deep clay jars. A little shrine blinked in the corner under soot, the way kitchen gods do after a long night. The jars dully nested into the stone for insulation, as if they were turtles deciding to live indoors. When the lid lifted, steam came up in a hush. Rentals had been thinking all night. Chickpeas had become scholarly around the edges. The city took a breath, and so did the stew. If you're still awake by the time I wander to the gladiator's porridge, feel free to subscribe, or just keep listening and let your eyelids practice their Roman arches. The Thermopolium was less a restaurant than a warm idea. People didn't sit so much as lean, which saved on chairs and conversation. The law declared these places must sell hot things, and Rome obeyed by ladling warmth into bowls, cups, and the atmosphere. On the wall, painted panels promised heroic meals roosters larger than hells, fish floating as nobly as senators. A dog curled beneath the counter with the ambition of a small rug. Coins clicked in clay dishes with the practical music of breakfast. A stranger could tell the hour by the steam, thin at dawn, generous by mid-morning, philosophical after the lunch rush. Somewhere, inevitably, an amphora tapped another amphora, the pottery equivalent of good morning. Bread arrived as if the day were impossible without it. Bakers had been awake since the city's lamps still pretended to be stars. Mills turned to the rhythm of donkeys who had mastered the art of mild disappointment. Flour rose in wooden tubs, each bowl dusted with yesterday's newsprint of bran. Loaves were stamped before baking, Modestus, Cellar, Primus names, impressed in dough like small signatures on the day. The oven swallowed the loaves with a sound that made hungry men nod. When the baskets came out, the air was warm enough to butter itself. Most loaves were scored into 8 wedges, which meant you could feed your family without the drama of slicing. And if you preferred, without even looking at them, bread was dependable. Wine was a negotiator. It arrived young, friendly, and eager to make friends with water. No one respectable drank it straight. That would be barbarian behavior, useful mainly for satire. A mixing bowl crater stood like a little governor, deciding ratios. 1 part wine to 2 parts water on a brisk day. Something gentler in summer. Something fiercer when the baker had been generous. Herbs joined with amateur enthusiasm. Honey was invited in to make things kind. Pitch from the lining of amphorae gave the faintest pine perfume, the way some cups remember forests even when the forest has moved on. A stone cup warmed the hands like a sleeping cat. For many, bread and watered wine pannies at Bynum was not a meal, but the comma between 2 obligations dot. By late morning, the street had settled into the soft trial of choosing. A pan kissed a pool of oil with a polite hiss. The fish fryer had learned a wrist flick you could measure time by. Fillets went in pale and came out golden, more confident than before. Garum waited in little bowls like talented roomers. The finest. Versions were clear as amber and cost real money. The cheerful everyday sauce was dark, salty, and wonderfully bossy. It had been made far away in vats of fermenting fish scraps, so large that even the sea felt slightly outdone. Mixed with vinegar, or with oil, or with honey if you wanted confusion, it turned fried fish into something worth mentioning to a friend. If curiosity smells like anything, it smells like a fresh batch of garum on a warm day. Vendors rehearse their callings without hurry. A bean seller tossed broad beans in a pan until their skins shone like coins. A man with chickpea fritters, pale gold and determined, sold them on little shards of pottery, biodegradable, economical, and unintentionally fashionable. Another carried a tray of little buns that took honey seriously. Roman stalls practiced minimalism, one good thing at a time, repeated until it became a custom. Children practiced economics by bargaining with bronze. Dogs studied engineering by observing where crumbs fell most reliably. A woman tasted a spoon of lentils and decided they needed more of whatever her grandmother used to put in, even if no one knew quite what that was. Sweetness arrived like a memory of the countryside. Honey was sugar's older cousin and more gossipy, bringing hints of the fields it came from, thyme hills, chestnut groves, wildflowers that had never imagined a city. Cakes tasted of cheese and flour and the optimism of deep oil. Clovey, the name as round as what it described, went in sticky and came out puffed, ready to meet a glaze of honey with catastrophic enthusiasm. There were pancakes like little moons, stippled with poppy seeds, dates stuffed with chopped nuts, and then warmed until they remembered what sunlight felt like. A cake seller sang the same 5-note advertisement all afternoon, and the city believed him because the melody had proof. Closer to the training yards, food traded conversation for stamina. Gladiators were nicknamed Horderi Barley Men, perhaps because barley stayed loyal through the long, repetitive theater of exercise. Barley gruel looked like a compromise and acted like a promise. It boiled with herbs when fortune smiled, with onions when fortune was busy, and with a dash of oil when the manager had counted the coins twice and found them agreeable. Trainers taught posture to casks as easily as to men. Bones, being sensible, asked for lime water, a dash of ash stirred into sour wine that tasted exactly like a lecture but kept skeletons optimistic. Between bouts of practice step, feint, pivot, breath, the men emptied bowls with the seriousness usually reserved for contracts. When the day asked for variety, yesterday's porridge returned as fried cakes. Bread, always auditioning for new roles, went stale with purpose and came back toasted with garlic, a lesson about second chances that philosophers would have written if they had been hungry. Lentils reintroduced themselves under a different name. Cheese nodded politely from a corner of the board. After a while, it was difficult to tell whether the training served the meals or the meals served the training. The kitchen learned to count ladles the way the arena counted applause not far from the city. Soldiers practiced the art of portable appetite. A Legionary's pack was a kitchen that folded, a hand quern for grinding grain, a skillet that knew its way around a campfire, skewers that could negotiate with sticks, a pot that listened to both boiling and gossip. Grain traveled well, so did patience. At night, 8 men in a tent ground just enough flour for the effort, then stirred a pot until the mixture thickened and the conversation thinned. The result pools was everything and nothing, adaptable to bacon when available, to garlic when morale required it, to herbs snipped from roadside plants that had unwisely stood near soldiers. Hard bread, buchelatum, rattled inside bags like small edible shields. You soaked it in water or wine until it forgave you. Cheese wedged into meals like punctuation. Figs trudged along as pocket desserts. Nuts pretended to be dinner and sometimes succeeded. Posca, vinegar, and water tasted like perseverance and made ordinary water behave. Salt was the polite gossip of the army. It went everywhere, improved everything, and left without fanfare. Pepper, when a man could afford a pinch, was a visiting celebrity. When the marching stopped near a friendly town, soldiers lined up at stalls for fried odds and ends, evidence that the military has understood snack breaks for a very long time. All of this came with the quiet risks that ride in any open kitchen. Heat and oil argued. Oil usually won. A ladle forgot which spoon had touched what. A nibble of yesterday appeared uninvited in today's stew. If meat leaned into summer for an hour too long, vinegar tried to charm it back into civility. Inspectors toured with solemn expressions, and guild rules spelled out the obvious in heroic Latin. Some stalls kept water buckets in the shadows to freshen wine. A chalk message on a wall helpfully noted, "Lucius waters the drink," which may have been Rome's earliest consumer review. People shrugged, thought, and told themselves that hot food is clean food, which is both often and not always true. Had its moods. Rome fetched it from far away through aqueducts, so self-assured they still stand around, looking pleased with themselves. Once water left those channels, though, it listened to whatever jar it found. Boiling helped. Mixing with wine or vinegar helped. Storing an amphory lined with pitch protected from surprise flavors, though it gave wine a small pine accent, like a conversation about trees that will not end. Sweet reductions of grape juice, defertum, and cepa thickened sauces into syrupy. Conviction. Some cooks boiled them in light vessels without a grasp of chemistry. Some didn't. The old recipes do not come with warnings, only with quantities and a kind of cheerful inevitability. Reduced by 1/3, add honey, taste, nod. Tables dined as if appetite were a sport with rules written by poets. Guests reclined on couches that domesticated laziness. The opening dishes eggs in various philosophical moods. Olives that had known many brines gave way to platters of fish and fowl with geography attached. And mullet swam proudly from the Bay of Pateli to a plate that had been waiting all morning. An overconfident sauce whispered that it contained pepper from somewhere exotic. The sweet course often looked like a parade of honey in different disguises. Pears that had studied caramel, dates stuffed and toasted, pastries shaped like animals that seemed slightly offended to learn they were edible. In the background, a moralist cleared his throat and composed a sentence beginning with, "In the good old days," which is a phrase that has never improved a dessert. Even extravagance had the rhythm of repetition. A cook flipped through the scroll of epicurious with the same expression modern cooks reserve for online recipes. Admiration mixed with suspicion. Dormouse? Perhaps not tonight. Brain sausage? Later, when the neighbors visit. But the kitchen still. Return to basics between adventures. Wheat bread crisp from the oven, a bowl of beans with mint, a dish of lettuce made interesting by garum, olive oil shining with the kind of dignity that does not need explanation. When everything else felt excessive, someone sliced a fig and poured a ribbon of honey across it, and the table relaxed as the light cooled. Shutters slid down with a tired tooth sound. A last customer hurried toward a stall, spoke tenderly to the shopkeeper, and received the scrapings from a pot, which tasted mostly like effort and contentment. The small shrine by the doorway received a final drop of wine. A boy scrubbed pans with sand in circles, circles, more circles, until the day looked polished. Dogs settled into warm curls, mastering the civic art of being almost in the way. The jars emptier now cooled thoughtfully, their rims brown with hours. Is easy to call this junk food. The quick bites and improvisations of a city that preferred a handheld solution. But junk is a category invented later. To those who leaned on those counters, it was simply how hunger and time shook hands. Bread stamped with a name could be traced like a complaint or praised like an uncle. Wine measured carefully could resemble prudence. Fried fish dipped in garum was a small holiday in the mouth. Honey cakes understood that the day needed an ending. That stuck to the fingers for a moment. A gladiator's barley gruel was not thrilling, and that was its excellence. A soldier's hard biscuit, softened in posca, tasted like the next morning would be possible. If you listen carefully to a Roman street that no longer exists, you can still hear the dailiness. The clack of a wooden lid closing is a sentence with a period. The fry pan's hiss is both applause and advice. A coin dropped into a dish completes an exchange older than complaints. Someone says, "The garum is very fine today," and someone else tries it just to make sure the statement is not an exaggeration. A child's face makes the sticky geometry of honey look like a theory of happiness. A loaf stamped cellar cools on a shelf and becomes a small biography you can eat. The city keeps chewing. History keeps calling it culture. The rest of us keep getting hungry. By late night, the counters dream their round-mouthed dreams. The baker's donkey imagines endless circles that end in warm bread. At the training yard, bowls are stacked like shields taking a nap. In a camp, 30 miles away, men blow on spoons and discuss, with great seriousness, whether garlic is a vegetable or a personality trait. Back at a wealthy house, a guest loosens his belt and whispers that the pears were persuasive. In every quarter, the day fades without deciding anything, except that tomorrow will also require oil, grain, and the patience of a pot. The Roman appetite appears in pieces, a ladle's arc, a stamp in dough, a shine of oil climbing a pan, a vendor's five-note song, the philosopher's frown as he eats the third olive anyway. None of these details argues loudly. They hum. They form a background you can rest your head against. Slowly, the stalls close in your imagination. The little shrine's flame thins and nods. Somewhere far off, a water carrier's steps count the last beats of the evening. If eyes drift shut here, they do so with a simple picture, a stone counter, cooling under night air, a row of jars breathing out the day, and the memory of honey still behaving like sunlight on your tongue. You might not expect the ancient equivalent of a fast food counter to be made of stone and decorated with a deck, but several of Rome's were. In the quiet before the market stirred, a shopkeeper would slide a wooden shutter upward with the careful sigh of old hinges and reveal a counter pocked with round openings the size of generous melons. These mouths held earthenware jars sunk deep into the masonry, each jar a small moon that kept soup and stew at respectable temperatures. A modest household shrine blinked from a shelf, a curl of incense thinking about going somewhere. The days. First customer leaned an elbow on polished tufa and peered into lentils that had simmered all night until the beans had opinions. If you're still awake by the time we reach the soldier's travel biscuits, feel free to subscribe, though it's perfectly acceptable to fall asleep somewhere around the fried fish. I'll never know. The jars do not gossip. The places were called thermopolia shops of hot things, though people shortened everything in practice, as people do. You did not so much sit as hover, the Roman version of standing desk culture, only. With stew, painted panels on the wall offered a menu and pictures, a rooster larger than any realistic rooster, a fish serenely horizontal as though posing for a mosaic, a loaf stamped with its baker's name like a small autobiography. In the corner, a dog practiced the art of being nearly in the way, occupying the warm tile directly in the path from cauldron to counter. Coins clicked into a shallow dish with the sound that meant breakfast, or perhaps breakfast and a little more, bread. Was the great dependable thing up before the sun with the bakers? A donkey circled the mill in the small hours the way the moon circles the city, with the patient rhythm of someone who has already accepted tomorrow. Bakers stirred dough in wide tubs until it pulled away from the wood like a curtain. Then they stamped the loaves before baking. In Pompeii, they favored the handsome round loaf scored into 8 wedges pennies, quadratus, so you could divide it without negotiations. Names pressed into the dough advertise responsibility. Modestus made this. Celer made this. Marcus's people baked this today. It was branding before logos, and it felt friendly in a way modern packaging rarely does. Wine arrived early, because water was shy and occasionally suspicious. No one respectable drank wine neat. That was for barbarians and cautionary poems. A big mixing bowl, the crater acted like the office manager of the beverage department. The ratios depended on weather, mood, and self-esteem, but water usually outvoted wine. Honey drifted in when kindness was needed, herbs when conversation was thin. A little resin from the amphora lining when the vineyard had a pine-scented childhood. The resulting drink wrapped the morning in a soft towel. It was less a buzz than a policy dot. By mid-morning, the street settled into the ancient problem of choosing. The fish fryer warmed oil in a bronze pan until it lifted a thin, promising smoke that smelled almost like courage. Fillets went in pale and came out with the color of late sunshine, more confident than before. Next to the pan, a line of little dishes waited for garum, the celebrity sauce of the Roman world, made by coaxing thyme, salt, and fish into a salty, complicated syrup. The grand tiers of amphorae at Coastal Factory's Belo Claudia liked there. Vats enormous had done the slow work months ago. What remained in the cup was affectionate to everything and bossy to most. A drop of vinegar woke it. A thread of honey introduced charm. Pepper arrived late, like an expensive guest, and getting everyone's attention with the single sneeze. The vendor of chickpea fritters looked exactly like someone who had perfected a wrist flick. Batter fell into the oil in polite dollops, then rose into little moons with crisp edges and soft centers. A shard of broken pottery eco-friendly plateware with no intention of becoming heirloom china held 3, 4, 5 fritters and a dab of sauce, and sometimes another dab because the first dab refused to be symmetrical. A bean seller across the way stirred broad beans in a shallow pan until their skins shone like new coins. Someone muttered that the beans needed more lovage, which is the kind of observation that can be both correct and completely unhelpful. Sweetness, in a city that prized salt, arrived like an improvised holiday. Honey was the sugar of record bringing, with it a faint memory of whatever fields the bees had gossiped in Thyme Hills perhaps, or the solemn depth of chestnut groves. A cake seller balanced a board across his head and sang the same reliable 5-note sales pitch for hours, proving that marketing has always been about repetition. He sold globy cheese and grain balls fried until their edges found geometry, then drenched them in a sheen of honey that made napkins theoretical. He also carried pancakes the size of a careful palm, freckled with poppy seeds and dates stuffed with ground nuts, warmed until they tasted like a very small afternoon dot behind the stalls. The alley kitchens managed their own choreography, a pot of lentils mumbling to itself, a mortar persuading herbs to get along, a small cask of defrutum, a syrup of reduced grape muscat, with the optimism of cooks who believed most sauces were one ladle of sweetness away from conclusion. Lead vessels, used by some to speed up the simmering, hid chemistry in cheerful ignorance. Others stuck to bronze and patience. The old cookbooks never scold. They simply ask you to reduce by 1/3, add honey until peace is achieved, and taste again in case fortune has changed its mind. Gladiators approached food from another angle entirely, that of persistence. The bones of fighters from Ephesus and elsewhere reveal a plant-heavy diet: barley, beans, occasional fruit, which doesn't sound dramatic, but does sound like good budgeting. They were nicknamed horderi, barleymen, not as an insult so much as a description of their loyalty to a grain that would never abandon them. Morning porridge thickened in a cauldron, the size of determination, and took on herbs if the quartermaster felt philosophical. Onions arrived like advice. Oil joined because it was friendly. The result slid into wooden bowls that went from hand to hand with a rhythm as steady as footwork drills. When porridge cooled, it returned as something else. Yesterday's mush met a hot pan and became crisp-edged cakes that tasted like another chance. Stale bread partnered with garlic and hot oil, then pretended to be supper with a surprising amount of dignity. Cheese had a way of showing up when protein was necessary for morale, which is often. Trainers advised lime water, the famous ash, or bone dust beverage for strong skeletons, a drink that tasted resolute rather than pleasant. If a fighter won, he might receive something more festive, but the training itself ran on barley and habit, and the men understood that predictability is a form of courage. On the road, soldiers solved appetite by folding the kitchen into a backpack. Each contubernum 8 men to a leather tent downed a hand mill that ground grain just quickly enough to feel like a decision. A shared pan, a pot with a loyal dent, and skewers that doubled as arguments completed the kit. They boiled pulse, a cousin of polenta, until it made small volcanoes, then quieted it with bits of bacon or a handful of wild greens if the march had been generous. The smell of garlic announced that supper had transitioned from obligation to confidence. Bread for marching came in hard, unforgiving discs, busselatum that rattled in the bag like small shields. You soaked it in wine and water or in posca, the Legion's vinegar drink that somehow tasted defiantly refreshing when the sun was tired of everyone. Cheese traveled in wedges wrapped with the philosophical patience of rinds. Figs dried in two. Portable afternoons. Nuts took on the role of emergency dinners. Pepper, that charming import, scattered itself like an argument in favor of spice trade. And salt quietest of all kept the world edible and the soldiers paid, sometimes literally. There were rules, of course. Rome loved rules the way these. Love hexagons. Collegia, the guilds of sellers and cooks, wrote down what they considered reasonable. Inspectors toured, serious men with a talent for lifting lids. The 12 tables threatened execution for bakers who substituted short waits with a romantic vigor that can only be called theoretical. More practically, a graffito in one wine shop claimed the proprietor watered the drink, a review as old as disappointment. Adulteration was a regular play in the economic theater. One more ladle of water in the soup, a little extra dilution in the amphora, an overfond relationship with yesterday. Some of it was harmless, some not, and people learned as we still do by. Shrugging by gossip, by finding the stall that rarely made them regret breakfast, food poisoning wore the same mild disguise then as now. The sun grew bold, a pot simmered too leisurely, and an unlucky vendor discovered the moral limits of summer. Vinegar tried to rescue meat that had read the wrong calendar. Herbs helped a little, boiling helped more. Medical writers offered remedies that read like complex prayers. Wine warmed and mixed with this leaf, that seed, a quantity of sleep, and a determination not to do that again. And yet the stall stayed open because hunger wins most arguments, and the city forgave with its usual practicality. Philosophers complained in their own styles. Seneca frowned at luxury and at his own frowning. Juvenal built poems from sneers, and clever rhymes about sauces that tried too hard. Pliny wandered through the subject of fish sauce with the affectionate curiosity of an uncle discussing unlikely pets. The complaints are useful mostly as historical spice. They tell us what? Worried people who had time to be worried. Meanwhile, 1,000 quiet hands kept lifting lids and serving ordinary bowls that never made it into literature because they behaved themselves. Wealthy houses, like planets with their own gravity, pulled street habits indoors and made them elegant. Dinner guests reclined on couches and sampled eggs in thoughtful arrangements, olives from jars with well-traveled biographies, and crusts of bread so new they were still deciding whether to be bread or sculpture. Fish arrived with a note about its birthplace. Peacocks, once regrettably fashionable, stared from platters like resigned teachers. Dessert meant fruit persuaded into cleverness and pastries that pretended to be tiny animals. The fashionable version of junk is simply junk with better tableware. A certain crisp cake, perfumed with bay leaf or fennel and drizzled with honey, ended more evenings than reforms ever did. The city's underbelly had its own indulgences, taverns soft with smoke, back rooms where dice learned new tricks, counters where you could exchange a coin for a bowl and a rumor. Gin palaces did not exist, but wine shops kept company with the same chorus of good intentions as every era's nightlife. The narrow lanes of the Subura exhaled garlic and gossip. Night watchmen carried lamps that understood the philosophy of limited light. Somewhere a cook reheated stew that had already lived 2 lives, and someone else declared it better than earlier proof, if needed. That time and heat are sometimes more convincing than ingredients. If there is a dark side to Roman fast food, it is not that it was unwholesome, some of it certainly was, but that it was everywhere ordinary as an odd. The poor leaned on it because they did not own ovens. The middling used it because they had errands. The rich tasted it through nostalgia because childhood always includes a corner stall. A city is measured as much by its snacks as by its statues. Rome's snacks were brisk, salty, honeyed, portable, and endlessly willing to be today, dot by late. Evening, shutters came down with the tired tooth sound they had practiced for years. A last customer negotiated for the scrapings at the bottom of the stew jar and left smiling with the quiet triumph of a bargain. The shopkeeper damped the coals, placed the last crumb near the small shrine, and counted coins with the accuracy of someone who has spent a lifetime learning what a day is worth. Ducks folded into themselves like warm towels. The counter, still faintly warm, seemed to let go of the day an inch at a time. What lingers is not a recipe, but a rhythm. The elbow leaned. Upon stone, the hiss of batter meeting oil, the confident clink of a ladle against a rim. It is the understanding that bread tastes different when it knows your name, and that wine watered on purpose is gentler to the afternoon. It is the extravagant logic of garum that something made by thyme and salt can make almost anything taste like itself and better. It is the practical beauty of a honey cake handed to a child whose eyes commit the entire confection to memory before the first bite. It is the steady courage of barley porridge and the unsung dignity of a biscuit soft in Posca on a windy camp night dot. If you find yourself drifting now, you can set down the cup and let the stall close itself. The jars will cool without supervision. The painted rooster will keep an eye on the door. Somewhere a baker's donkey prepares to trace slow circles through the dark, and flour dust rehearses its small clouds. The city thins to footsteps and distant voices. What remains is a simple picture, as sleep finds it useful. A stone counter exhaling the last of its heat. A line of earthenware mouths, quiet and clean, and the thought of honey still behaving like a warm patch of sunlight behind the teeth.